So to locate prey, you can just use passive detection of the prey's electric field to be able to tell that it's there, or you can um, generate your own electric field. And those two things are really pretty different. Um, if you look at an electric fish that's generating its own electric field, like I say, it's almost like having like radar around the body of the animal, because it's generating this electric field. Anything that enters that electric field is going to distort it. If it's a good conductor, it's going to distort it in one way. If it's a bad conductor, it's going to distort it in another way, but it's going to distort it. So the fish is actually going to get not only know that there's something there, but also get some information about what the object is, based on how the electric field is being distorted. Another sensory modality is the ability to detect mechanical vibration. So if you're going to detect mechanical vibration in a fluid, so air or water, you need some special sensory structures to be able to do that. But if you're just talking about mechanical vibration because something is in contact with the animal, probably all animals except sponges can detect that just using their sense of touch, that something's against them moving. Now, we've talked about the lateral line system a little bit. Fish have this lateral line system. It's a canal that's open to the water. So here's the pores that lead out to the water. This is outside the animal. This is the canal of the lateral line. And inside the lateral line, you've got clusters of hair cells or neuromast cells. These are sensory cells that will generate an action potential when the hairs are bent. And there are different ones. There are some that take a lot more energy to bend the hairs than others. So the fish is getting information about how strong the movement is in the water, the pressure wave is in the water, based on how many of those hair cells get mobilized to generate action potentials. So anything that's moving water around a fish, the fish is going to be able to pick that up using its lateral line system. And it's really kind of hard to imagine what that must be like for the fish. Now, the sense that this is most closely related to in animals that live in air is their sense of hearing, although it's probably not much like the sense of hearing. It's probably more of being able to, more like a sense of touch. You're just being able to kind of feel how the water is moving around you. So it's hard to imagine, but there's some similarities between this and hearing, which makes us think that this is a sense that's pretty closely tied to hearing in land vertebrates. So first of all, let's talk about sound. Sound has an intensity, which is the volume, how loud it is, and it's a function of the amplitude of the vibrations in whatever medium we're talking about, usually air. The pitch is determined by the frequencies that are being generated in these repeating pressure waves, how fast they're coming. And then how the sound pattern changes over time can also contain a lot of information. So the changing in intensity and pitch over time contain information. So these are the three main properties of sound. Birds and mammals are the animals that are best able to sense all three of these things. And really, detecting sound is it's the premier mammal sense. Birds can hear very well, but there are mammals that can hear better than any bird. So when it comes to actually hearing, in invertebrates, it's not very well developed, and usually it's sort of an on-off function. If certain frequencies of sound at certain volumes are hitting the animal, then it just gets a signal to its brain that there's sound hitting it. It's not getting the same kind of information that we are with our hearing. In fish, the water transmits sound very effectively over long distances, and fish basically have otoliths, which literally translates to ear stones, that are in little structures in their skulls, and as the sound waves pass through them, it makes those otoliths move around, and the otoliths are physically hitting the hair cells and making hair cells fire. So it's a system of hearing, but again, it's pretty different than ours. In amphibians and reptiles, well, and in birds, they have a hearing apparatus similar to ours. However, there's the connection between the eardrum, the tympanic membrane, and the nervous connection to the ear, the cochlea, it's a simple connection. There's only one bone that connects those two structures, and that's not true in mammals. So birds, remember, birds are basically diapsids. They still have the same kind of jaw articulation that most diapsids have. So they've just got a single ear bone that connects their eardrum to the cochlea. Mammals, because they've got this very specialized jaw articulation, it freed up some extra bones that are used as part of the jaw in birds. So those bones have actually been co-opted to become part of this linkage between the physical linkage between the eardrum and the cochlea. So like I say, there's only one mammal, and it's humans, so there's a human diagram again. What you're seeing here is a slice through the auditory system of a human. Now, what we often call the ear is this part out here. It's called, in human anatomy, they call the flap of the ear the auricle. In zoology, it's called the pinna. But all it's doing is helping to funnel the sound into the ear canal. And down in the ear canal, you then have the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. So that's the eardrum is the dividing line between the outer ear and the middle ear. So everything from the eardrum towards the outside of your skull is outer ear. Once you pass through the eardrum, you're in a small air-filled chamber. That's the middle ear. And the significant things that are in the middle ear are the three bones that connect the eardrum to the cochlea. And also you have the auditory tube, or the eustachian tube, that basically allows this chamber to equalize the pressure with the air pressure outside. It can't, if you've got a direct connection through the eardrum, an air hole here, the trouble is the eardrum doesn't move very much, so it starts screwing up your sense of hearing. But you need some connection to the outside to be able to equalize the pressure. So that's where the auditory tube, or the eustachian tube, comes in. Now, once we get to the end of these three bones, so here they are, the three bones, right here is where we enter the inner ear. The inner ear is the cochlea, and this is where these mechanical vibrations, the physical movements, are converted into nerve impulses that then get sent to the brain. So the cochlea is twisted, it coils, it's sort of like a snail's shell. And you can see we've got the nervous connection is coming out and heading to the brain. So this is where those nerve impulses are being generated, is inside the cochlea. Now, it's actually easier to tell what's going on in the cochlea if we uncoil it. So we're going to uncoil it here in a few minutes. But you've got a series of canals in here. They usually say there's three of them, which I think is a little bit misleading. So the tympanic canal is down here, or the scala tympani, but tympanic canal. The vestibular canal is up here, or the scala vestibuli. And the reason that I say it's a little bit misleading is that those two canals that I've just circled are the same canal. If you could take a little submarine up one of them and spiral your way up to the tip of the cochlea, they're connected. You're going to come down the other one. They are connected at the end. They're one canal. And then you do have one that's separate. The cochlear duct is right here. And the cochlear duct is really important, because that is where the sound is literally converted into nerve impulses, is in the cochlear duct. So that's an important point. So if we zoom in, here are the 3 canals again, or really 2 canals, but they look like 3 canals if you take a cross section like that. And let's zoom in on what's going on here in the cochlear duct, because that's really important. So there's this structure hanging out over the top of the nerve cells called the tectorial membrane. And underneath that are hair cells or neuromast cells. And if the tectorial membrane gets deflected, it's going to push on some of those hair cells. And of course, if you push on the hairs, that's going to make a nerve impulse happen. You're going to get an action potential. So that's literally the location that the physical movement of sound is converted into a nerve impulse. Now what we're going to do is uncoil the cochlea, because it makes more sense, just easier to visualize if you can see it uncoiled. So there's the cochlea uncoiled. Now the reason that it isn't really uncoiled is that it takes too much space in your skull, so it has to be coiled up, otherwise it's like a big spear from each ear, poking right almost through your skull. So here's the middle ear with the 3 bones. As the tympanic membrane vibrates, it moves these bones. That vibration is transmitted to a little membranous window here called the oval window. Now, I should mention that the whole cochlea is embedded in solid bone, and of course it's full of, well, essentially water. It's water with some stuff dissolved in it, but it's essentially water. And you can't compress a liquid like water, right? You can compress air, you can do that, but you can't compress water. And so if we're going to push on the water through this flexible membrane where the oval window is here, we have to be able to have somewhere that water can push out, because this whole structure is embedded in solid bone. So there's another place right here where we've got a thin membrane that's not actually hooked up to anything, but it kind of is right up against the middle ear, and that's called the round window. So if you were to push on the oval window this way, the round window is pushed out a little bit. So that gives you the ability to actually move the fluid that's in the vestibular and tympanic canals. All right, so if you are hearing a sound, you're getting pressure waves that are repeating, and it's making the tympanic membrane vibrate. It's moving those 3 ear bones and pushing on the oval window, and so it's moving the fluid back and forth inside the vestibular and cochlear canal. That sets up standing pressure waves inside the cochlea, and what it winds up doing is pushing on that tectorial membrane at different points in the cochlear canal. And the way that it works is that if you were to go in and stimulate some of those hair cells that are, well, near the base of the cochlea, because this is down near the base, it's not the tip of the spiral, it's down at the base, that's going to, you're going to perceive that as being a high-pitched sound, because what would normally stimulate those hair cells are very high-pitched sounds. The farther you get up through the cochlea, if you stimulate hair cells at these points, you're going to perceive that as lower and lower pitches, lower and lower frequency sounds. So the way that this works is that it's based on the physics of sound waves and how they work. And so there is, just because of the size, there's a relationship between the size of the cochlea and the range of sounds that an animal can hear. We're kind of middle-sized, so we hear a lot of the sounds that other animals can at least partially hear, but there are sounds, obviously a lot of sounds, that are much too high-pitched for us to hear, and there are also a lot of sounds that are much too low-pitched for us to hear. And if you think about the size of your cochlea, it's not really a very big proportion of your skull, but we can hear from approximately 15 hertz to 15,000 hertz, somewhere in that range. As you get older, you start losing the high the high-pitched sounds kind of quit working, and you don't hear those anymore. But you can imagine an animal that's a lot bigger than we are. Think about an animal like an elephant. So if you talk to an elephant can probably hear most of the sounds that you're generating, but to the elephant, it sounds very, very high pitched. And it was only, well, I think just, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, something like that, that we realized that elephants can talk to each other over kilometers using very, very low frequency sound. And it seems like, well, they should have realized that low frequency sounds propagate for really long distances. High frequency sounds kind of dissipate in the atmosphere pretty quickly, so they don't tend to go very far. But really low frequency sounds can go a long ways. And of course, elephants are making ultra low frequency sounds that we can't hear at all. And this was discovered because people were watching in a national park in Africa. You had biologists watching different groups of elephants and taking notes on them, and you had two different groups that were miles apart, and at the same moment they suddenly stopped what they were doing and started moving to the same location, and they met up. And the biologists realized that later on when they were comparing their notes, that these two groups that were nowhere near each other stopped what they were doing at the same moment. Well, it's because they were talking to each other. They were calling back and forth, and so they knew what was going on with the other group. And so later on, then they tried to pick up these ultra low frequency sounds, and it turns out elephants communicate with low frequency sounds that we can't hear. And of course, smaller animals are picking up really high frequency sounds. And so when you get to really small animals, like something like a mouse, they're able to pick up sounds that are such high frequency that of course we can't hear them. And if you talk to your cat, your voice probably sounds pretty low to your cat. Your cat can hear into the ultrasonic range, high frequency sounds that we can't hear. But of course, they can hear most of the range that we can hear also. So your cat hears you when you're talking to it, but they're probably not hearing the low end of the sounds that you're making. But if you talk about an animal that's a lot smaller, there are mice that sing like birds sing, and we didn't realize that again until fairly recently, because we didn't have the technology to pick up these ultra high frequency sounds. But they basically have songs and they defend their territories, they sing, but they're such high frequency sounds that we can't hear them. Some animals have extreme sensitivity to sounds. So the pictures of the skulls that you're seeing here are from kangaroo rats, and we talked about them in terms of how they're water independent. They don't ever drink. And these are animals that are native to the southwestern part of the U.S. They are native here to Southern California. In addition to that, they have extreme sensitivity. Now they're small animals, certainly compared to us, so they tend to hear higher frequency sounds than we hear, but they can hear sounds that are at an incredibly low volume. And if you look at the skull, this is where the cochlea and that inner ear apparatus is housed, and here's where the other one is housed. And you notice the two of them together are actually bigger than the brain of the animal, which is right here. So these animals can hear these incredibly low intensity quiet sounds, and that is there because that ear morphology is so modified and takes up such a big part of their skull. It's so huge that they can hear the sound of a rattlesnake's scales sliding across the ground. So they can tell when a rattlesnake is coming at them. And here's maybe a little bit better picture. Some other rodents have this as well, but kangaroo rats have the most extreme version. So again, here's where the cochlea is housed in the skull, the left one and the right one. Now the thing is, this ability comes with a cost, because if somebody drives a motorcycle near the burrow of a kangaroo rat, even when it's in the burrow during the daytime, that motorcycle is so loud that it destroys the animal's hearing. It's basically like being near a nuclear explosion. It just blows out their hearing. And so after that, they can't hear prey coming or predators coming, and so their mortality goes way up. Another function of sound is echolocation. So this involves both generating sounds and then being able to detect them, hearing them. And of course, bats are the famous ones for this, but cetaceans can do it. Waddell seals can do it, and a few birds can do it. Oilbirds and birds' nest swiftlets can do it. And these are birds that actually roost in caves, and so they actually have a clicking sound that they make, and they can echolocate. I don't think that these birds can echolocate nearly as well as the mammals can, but they can do it. So echolocation is a form of natural sonar. And we actually didn't even realize that it was happening until well into the 20th century. And basically during World War II, when they had submarines with hydrophones so that they could hear the engines of ships, moving around, they started hearing all these other sounds that were the sounds of marine organisms that were echolocating. And nobody realized that that was happening until that point. This is the skull of a blind river dolphin. River dolphins have evolved independently in major river systems around the world. And, the thing is that in the oceans, the water is usually pretty clear. So even though vision may not be quite as useful as it is, for us living in the air, it's still pretty useful. If you're in a big muddy river, yeah, your vision is probably not really doing you any good at all. And so these animals could already echolocate, but then now there's selection pressure to basically, or there's no selection pressure keeping the eyes working, and so the eyes basically wind up not working after a long enough time. Now, what blind river dolphins are able to do, and in fact, a lot of cetaceans can do this. So the skull has got kind of an odd shape, and of course, it's not the shape of the head. This is a big blob of lipids right here. It's called the melon, and it's surrounded, that capsule of lipids is surrounded by muscles. And what it is an acoustic lens. So these animals, when they're generating sounds, they're basically making noises, they can change the shape of that melon and focus those sounds out in different directions. And then what echolocation is then listening to the echoes. When the sound that you just generated bounces off something and comes back to you, you can tell about how big that object is, how far away it is from you, how it's moving relative to you. So you can get a lot of information about what's going on around you using this technique. Now, I mean, we can do it. You can do it. Some blind people get very good at it with an awful lot of practice. But everybody can do it to a certain extent. It's an obvious one would be that if you're, well, not driving, but if you're a passenger in a car with the window rolled down, you can close your eyes and you can hear every parked car you drive past. And that's because the sound of your engine is bouncing off the parked car, and so the way that echo comes back at you is different if there's a car parked there that you're driving past versus no car parked there. And that's just a very simplistic way of doing it, but if you're an animal that can really echolocate, you can tell a lot about what's going on. And in fact, some recent work has shown that some of these cetaceans can actually see inside an animal. They're able to detect their organs. It's something like an ultrasound. Bats are famous for their ability to echolocate. And here you've got a bat that's generating the pulse of sound, and you can see it's holding its mouth in a very funnel-shaped way to focus that sound. Now, you have a problem when you're echolocating, though, because you have to generate a pulse of sound and then listen for the echo. Well, the pulse of sound that you're screaming out is going to be much, much louder than the echo that's going to bounce back to you when that sound hits something. And of course, when you're screaming at the top of your lungs, like cetaceans do and bats do, that can stun your hearing. And so when you scream like that, now your ears are less sensitive to low intensity sounds. And one of the things that mammals can do that other animals can't really do with their hearing is because mammals have that series of 3 bones that basically transmits the mechanical vibration from the tympanic membrane to the cochlea. Muscles attached to those bones can start locking them in place. So at the moment this bat is screaming, it's basically deadening its own hearing because it's tensing those muscles on those ear bones and keeping them from vibrating very much. So it's not getting the full intensity of that sound into its cochlea. It's not allowing that sound to be transmitted into the cochlea. And then once it stops screaming, it relaxes those muscles so that it has the sensitivity of hearing to pick up the echoes. There is an arms race going on between bats, most of which eat insects that fly at night, and those insects, those night-flying insects. So this is a moth, and obviously it's an insect. Moths have hearing. It's nowhere near as sophisticated as what you'd find in bats, but they do have a sense of hearing. They've got a tympanic cavity with a tympanic membrane. So here's the cavity. The tympanic membrane is inside that. You can't really see it. And they do have a left one and a right one. There's one on each side of the body. So they can hear, but they can't hear in the same sense that we hear. So with the moth, let's imagine that moth is flying around at night minding its own business. If there's a bat in the area, bats can see, of course, but they don't see very well at night, just like we don't see very well at night. And if you're flying, you're moving fast and you have to be able to make very precise controls, turns, and really be able to tell what's going on around you. So they're echolocating all the time when they're flying. So they're making a lot of noise. Now, most of the sounds that bats make are at frequencies too high for us to hear. So, when bats are flying around, you don't hear them screaming at the top of their lungs, but that's what they're doing. They do make things that you can get now called bat detectors, which are basically ultrasonic microphones. You kind of point up at bats flying around, and when they're vocalizing, it picks up that ultrasonic sound and lowers the pitch to the point that we can hear it, and it's playing it back to you in real time. And there are people that get really good at identifying what bats are around based on their calls, just like you can do with birds. You just need a little bit more technological assistance to do it. So if this moth is flying around and there are bats around, those bats are making a lot of noise. So inside, here's a simplified version of the ear of the moth. So you've got air sacs inside. Here's the tympanic membrane right here. So out here, we're outside the body of the moth. And if that tympanic membrane vibrates, there are actually 2 nerve cells attached to it. There are 2 nerve cells. It's called the A1 and A2 nerve fibers. And like I say, the moth's hearing is kind of on or off. It doesn't have that whole range of intensities and pitches that we have. So imagine that moth is flying around and there's a bat flying, but it's not too close. So that means that when the bat is vocalizing, the pulses of sound that reach the moth are not very loud. They're not high intensity. If that's the case, the A1 fiber will fire. This is the fiber that is sensitive to those low intensity sounds. And like I say, the moth isn't really hearing all the details of the bat's vocalization. It's basically just like turning on a warning light that's saying there's a bat somewhere in the area. Now the moth has 2 of these eardrums, one on each side of its body. So if the moth is flying around and the A1 fiber on in the left ear of the moth fires, that means the moth is on your left side, right? Because the right one didn't fire. So what do? Well, you turn away from the bat. You turn towards the right. And now you're flying away from the bat. Now, of course, the bat is getting echoes from the moth, and it knows where the moth is, knows that it's a moth, it knows the direction it's flying. It has a lot of information about the moth. So the bat, if the bat's hungry and it picks up that moth, it knows where it is and it's going to start flying towards it. So as the bat gets closer, it may be screaming out pulses of sound that are the same volume as far as the bat is concerned, but as the bat gets closer to the moth, the sound intensity keeps going up as the bat is closing in on the moth. At some point, when the bat gets very close, the A2 fiber fires. That fiber is not very sensitive to low intensity sounds, so it takes a pretty good volume for it to fire. So when it fires, that means, as far as the moth is concerned, that means you're in trouble. That means the bat is on top of you. And so when the A2 fiber fires, when either one of them fires, it's basically the moth's central nervous system sends it into a power dive. And you can see that here. This is a very old photo. It was taken with a strobe light. It's a multiple exposure. So this is the bat flying through the scene here. And you can see when the bat's wings are open and when they're closed as it's flapping. So that's the bat flying through. Here's the moth up here flying around just fine. Right here is when the A2 fiber fired. And look at what the moth does. Instead of just flying around, it starts going into a power dive, spiraling into the ground. And as it does that, now the bat is faster than the moth, but of course it's also a lot bigger and heavier. So the moth is more maneuverable in the air than the bat is. So the moth is basically able to outmaneuver the bat, at least in the short term. The bat, you can see, is trying to turn, but it's taking a while to come back around and come back at the moth. The moth is spiraling down into the ground. Now, as it gets down into the ground, and the bat's still echolocating, but now there's, everything is bouncing sound back to the bat. All the leaves from the bushes and the ground and everything around it is bouncing echoes back to the bat. When the moth was just up in the air, it was sending a pretty clear signal back to the bat. Now that it's down in the bushes, it's very difficult for the bat to find. And so there's this evolutionary arms race going on between these insects that fly at night and bats that are using echolocation to find them.